War in 1983, then the miners in 1984, Europe in 1988. I could carry on. But basically there was always someone that she was able to define herself against. Indeed, and this is something that Blair picks up, the increasingly unpopular and isolated these figures become, the more that they are able to say that's the test of true leadership. We're not following opinion polls. Okay? We're doing what it is that we think is right. And somehow the electorate found that an incredibly beguiling quality. It also meant that they projected themselves as British Prime Ministers of old, of having a place on the world stage. In fact, what Thatcher and Blair did was basically follow obediently behind whatever Reagan, Bush, or Clinton told them to do. But nonetheless, they were able to say, look, our involvement in challenging the Soviet Union or in the Gulf Wars or in invading Afghanistan is a sign of Britain's renewed position in the world and their ability to be able to show their old forms of moral imperial leadership of it. The last point I want to make here is that politics then becomes much less about the policy of specific politicians than about their character. Elections became increasingly a type of character test, and leaders who were not these strong, determined, iron-willed types of figures fared really badly. And probably the two great illustrations of that is John Major, Thatcher's successor, and Gordon Brown, Tony Blair's successor, both of whom were popularly thought to be slightly weak and ineffective leaders. Centralization. I'm just going to remark upon this. One of the things that separates out the two parties here was their approach to the distribution of power. Mrs. Thatcher was determined to take power away from local government because local government, particularly big inner city urban authorities, remained doggedly Labour in orientation and continued to use public expenditure in ways in which the Thatcher administration thought was irresponsible. And probably the greatest illustration of that was her outright abolition of the Greater London Council in 1986. Tony Blair, in contrast, sought to, or rhetorically anyway, found the devolution of power away from Whitehall as an important part of his initial appeal. And it's Blair who finally pushes through the devolution that the Labour Party failed to deliver in the 1970s with the referendums in 1997 for the Scottish Parliament and the assemblies in Wales and Northern Ireland, and even the creation of a new London authority governed by this new figure, the Mayor of London, in 2000. Blair also spent the best part of a decade trying to figure out how to reform the House of Lords, and in 2004 they finally abolished hereditary peers. So the aristocracy, which were given a seat in the House of Lords by birth, continued to do so all the way to 2004. Okay? So the second chamber, our House, our Senate, continued to be dominated by hereditary peers, alarmingly down to the 21st century. The point that I want to make here very quickly, because I'm running out of time, is the rise of the security state, basically, in Britain. The rule of law was very important to Mrs. Thatcher as a way of restoring and remoralising what she thought was the moral collapse that had occurred in the 1960s. And yet, if you look at the prison population, it remains remarkably static during the terms of her office, rises just from 41 to 45,000 people. It is under the new Labour administration that the prison population grows, doubles. I mean, it's just amazing the levels of incarceration of contemporary Britain, which now looks sort of almost California in terms of the cost of its prisons. There's also, alongside that, the rise of the so-called security state through, not through policing, which is too expensive to put policemen on the street, but through a whole set of devolved forms of policing. So not just neighbourhood watches, where people peer out from behind their curtains to see whether you're visiting a neighbour or burgling them, but the increasing use of CCTV and of speed cameras on roads. There are something like 4 million speed cameras in Britain. I get a speeding ticket every time I go back there, seemingly. And there are alarmingly something like 500,000 cameras in London alone, which means that most Londoners are meant to be filmed something like 300 times a day. And of course, they have no choice in that. Again, I'm going to just I'm going to murder this slide by going straight to one point that I want to make. Mrs. Thatcher was in many ways, as I said at the beginning, a very morally authoritarian type of prime minister in her belief in the sanctity of the family and the rule of law. In other words, she believed, importantly, that ironically the state that she in some ways wanted to strip away had an important role to play in terms of maintaining moral authority and the moral conduct of citizens. Arguably, Tony Blair takes a very different type of approach and is happier, even though the levels of incarceration rise under Blair, he also devolves responsibility back to the market, okay, in a quite extraordinary type of way. So it's Blair, for instance, who relaxes the licensing laws in 2000 and decriminalizes marijuana. There's a way in which Blair thinks that the market will provide some type of self-regulating system for moral behavior. The other point that I wanted to make here was that increasingly the market is seen as the sphere of moral, of ethical citizenship. Okay, the market is the place where you display how good a moral person you are, either in terms of choosing at what time you stop drinking, or in terms of what products you consume. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Anita Ruddock and the Body Shop is arguably one of the greatest commercial successes of the Thatcher era. It was established the Body Shop was established in Brighton in 1976. By 1982, there were 2 shops opening every month. It went public in 1985. By 1990, it was operating in 39 countries, including the US. And there's a way in which the Body Shop, with its self-conscious environmentalism, save the whales, no cruelty against animals, and then human rights, provided a way in which people displayed, by their choice of cosmetics, how morally centered they were. So the market then becomes a way a central mechanism for our moral government, in contrast to the state. And I'm suggesting to you that Thatcher and New Labour were more or less on the same page there. My last slide before the most earth-shattering of all conclusions is to discuss what happens to politics, or politics in the way in which it had become institutionalized from the late 19th century. There are two things that you really want to note here. One is the quite cataclysmic drop of the election turnouts from 1950, where it's up just below 85%, down to 60% in 2001. And you can see that basically from the 1970s, that decline has been pretty precipitous. Okay, so less and less people are believing that the ballot box or that Westminster is the way to transform society. You can also see that, I think, just as clearly in these graphs, this is membership of the Conservative Party, okay, and membership of the Labour Party, okay, both of which at this point have only their joint membership amounts to less than 1% of the electorate. Okay, so clearly the British people are not invested in the political process in quite the way that they were in the 1940s and the 1950s. And yet, and maybe because, one of the things that has been very noticeable in the last decade or so has been the return to the mass mobilization of people demonstrating on the streets. Famously, of course, over 1 million people marched in the anti-war march of 2003. It was the largest demonstration against the Iraq War in the world. The Countryside Alliance even got 400,000 people protesting against the ban on fox hunting and the condition of rural areas in 2002, and of course the student protests of 2009-10 generated protests of between 60 and 100,000 people. That type of if you like, occupation of the streets of London is something that really hadn't been seen since the 1970s and the early 1980s. So there's clearly, what I'm suggesting is a sort of dissatisfaction with the political process and fascination or an interest in trying to explore new forms of political organization and mobilization. And I think that's going to be a very important story in the months and years ahead. Okay. Oh my God, I've got to talk about the Millennium Dome. Okay. I've got one other point to say. This is a very simple point to make. Millennium Dome began really as a project under the Major administration, but when New Labour got elected, it sort of embraced it. And there are two things to say about the Millennium Dome. One is that it was an attempt to regenerate this urban area in the south of the City of London, on the other side of the Thames. And the other is that it was projected as a commercial operation. There's no way that the Great Exhibition or the Festival of Britain would have been called the Festival of Britain Experience or the Great Exhibition Experience. Okay? There's a way, there's the commodification and commercialization of this grand state display tells you a lot, I think, about the centrality of market principles to social and political